She called it her miracle baby, a symbol of hope after years of heartbreak. Kayla Netherland McBride had fought relentlessly for the future she dreamed of. Where did she go wrong? She only wanted a child to love, to nurture, to call her own. But on a cold January night in 2025, that dream was stolen in a moment of unimaginable cruelty. In the quiet suburb of Indianapolis, a community that prided itself on its calm and safety, the unthinkable happened. A husband's smoldering rage erupted into a meticulously calculated act of violence, leaving behind devastation no one could have foreseen. This wasn't a crime of passion or a spur-of-the-moment decision. What unfolded that evening was premeditated. A betrayal so cold and deliberate that it shattered not just lives, but the illusion of normalcy in an unsuspecting town. The tragedy sparked outrage and heartbreak, leaving everyone who knew them, and even those who didn't, grappling with one burning question. How could this happen? What signs were missed? And could Kayla's story have ended differently if someone had intervened? This is the harrowing story of a woman who dared to hope, a mother-to-be who longed to cradle her child in her arms, and the man who turned that dream into a nightmare. It's a story of love, betrayal, survival, and the haunting aftermath of a tragedy that no one saw coming. Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share stories like Kayla's, spread awareness, and inspire action. Indianapolis, a city that blends urban life with tranquil neighborhoods. On the surface, it's a place where families thrive, where life moves at a steady, comforting pace. Among these neighborhoods was a small, tree-lined street, home to Kayla Netherland McBride, a place she once thought would hold her happiest memories. Kayla's life was one defined by resilience. For years, she had faced the heartache of infertility, enduring endless tests, treatments, and dashed hopes. Her desire to become a mother was unyielding, even when the odds were against her. After years of setbacks, Kayla finally had her miracle. She was pregnant. To her, this child was more than a blessing. It was a testament to her strength, her persistence, and her unwavering faith in the future. Friends described Kayla as the kind of person who lit up every room she entered. Her laughter was infectious, and her positivity seemed boundless, even during the hardest times. This pregnancy, they said, gave her a new glow. She couldn't stop talking about baby names, nursery designs, and the life she planned to build for her little one. But beneath the surface of this joy was a marriage teetering on the edge. Jeremy McBride was not the man Kayla had fallen in love with years ago. Once a doting husband, Jeremy's behavior had grown increasingly unpredictable. Those closest to Kayla noted the tension between them, the arguments, and Jeremy's growing resentment. Their relationship had been strained for years, but the pregnancy, instead of mending the cracks, seemed to deepen them. Jeremy had expressed doubts, questioned his role as a father, and voiced frustrations that others found unsettling. He withdrew, isolating himself from Kayla and the life they had once dreamed of building together. Kayla's friends noticed her becoming quieter about her marriage. Though she remained hopeful on the surface, there were moments when her worries slipped through. She confided in her sister once, saying she wasn't sure what the future held for her and Jeremy, but she was determined to give her child the best life possible. For Jeremy, however, the pregnancy wasn't a miracle. It was a breaking point. Over time, he became consumed by anger and jealousy. Those who interacted with him described a man wrestling with emotions he couldn't control. His words grew sharper, his presence darker. While Kayla focused on creating a life for her child, Jeremy seemed to spiral into a world of his own, one fueled by bitterness and obsession. Their relationship had reached a tipping point, but no one could have predicted just how far Jeremy was willing to go. As Kayla prepared for the arrival of her baby, she likely never imagined that the person she once trusted the most would become the greatest danger to her and her unborn child. What happened next would forever change the lives of everyone who knew her and leave a community grappling with unimaginable loss. By late 2024, Jeremy McBride's life had taken a dark and dangerous turn. What had started as subtle frustrations about his marriage and impending fatherhood spiraled into something far more sinister. He stopped talking to friends, skipped work more frequently, and withdrew from the world around him. For Jeremy, the walls seemed to be closing in. Those closest to him noticed the shift, his tone more clipped, his temper quicker to ignite. Small grievances became full-blown arguments in his mind. and every perceived slight from Kayla festered into something darker. Behind closed doors, Jeremy began writing notes, angry, disjointed thoughts that painted a disturbing picture of his mental state. He scribbled about betrayal, about how life felt unfair, and how he believed no one truly understood him. One note read, "She's moving on without me, taking everything. I won't let it happen." Another, "They'll regret this. I'll make sure of it." These writings were fragments of a man unraveling, consumed by jealousy and resentment. But Jeremy didn't stop with words. He began to take deliberate steps toward a plan that only he knew existed. In early January 2025, Jeremy walked into a gun shop on the outskirts of Indianapolis. Calm and composed, he filled out the necessary paperwork, passed the background check, and walked out with a handgun and a box of ammunition. The store clerk would later recall nothing unusual about the transaction. He was polite, seemed normal, they'd say, but in reality, Jeremy's purchase was anything but routine. It was a calculated step in what would soon become a tragic series of events. Over the next several days, Jeremy visited a local shooting range multiple times. Surveillance footage from the facility showed him methodically loading, aiming, and firing his weapon. Witnesses at the range described him as quiet, focused, and eerily detached. To those around him, these actions might have seemed ordinary, but for Jeremy, they were preparations. Each bullet fired at the range brought him closer to his final act. Jeremy's anger wasn't just simmering, it was boiling over. He believed Kayla had betrayed him, that her happiness and independence were direct affronts to him. In his mind, the child she carried, a child she called a miracle, only deepened the chasm between them. As the days ticked closer to January 19, Jeremy's actions became more deliberate. He began watching Kayla's house, parking a few blocks away and observing from a distance. He noted when she came and went, when neighbors were most likely to be out, and when the house was quiet. These weren't the actions of someone acting in a fit of passion. They were the calculated moves of someone preparing for the unthinkable. A psychological expert reviewing the case later remarked, "This wasn't a man who simply snapped. This was someone who let anger and jealousy build over time until he could no longer see past them. He wasn't just planning a crime. He was preparing for what he believed would be his final statement." Law enforcement professionals would later emphasize the premeditated nature of Jeremy's actions. "The evidence shows us that he knew exactly what he was doing," they said. "This wasn't spur of the moment. He planned every step." By the time January 19 arrived, Jeremy McBride had made up his mind. In his view, there was no turning back. January 19, 2025 began like any other Sunday on Kayla's quiet street. Neighbors were enjoying the last hours of the weekend, children played outside, and the air was filled with a calm that no one imagined would soon be shattered. Around 6:30 p.m., Jeremy McBride parked his car a short distance from Kayla's home. He sat for a moment, the engine idling as he stared at the house that had once been his. He knew Kayla was home. Her car was in the driveway and the lights in the living room glowed faintly through the curtains. Jeremy stepped out of the car, the handgun tucked into the waistband of his jeans, and began walking toward the house. Witnesses later reported seeing a man walking down the street with his head lowered, his pace steady but unhurried. Inside the house, Kayla was enjoying a quiet evening. She was just a few weeks away from her due date, and every detail of her nursery had been meticulously prepared. It was a space filled with hope. Tiny onesies folded neatly in drawers, a crib waiting to hold her baby, and soft colors painted on the walls. At 6:43 p.m., neighbors reported hearing a loud crash, followed by a series of muffled shouts. Jeremy had forced his way into the house, catching Kayla completely off guard. What happened in the moments that followed remains a blur of chaos. Kayla tried to reason with him, pleading for her life and the life of her unborn child, but Jeremy's mind was set. At 6:47 p.m., the first gunshot rang out, piercing the quiet night. Then another, and another. A neighbor walking their dog nearby heard the commotion and froze. "It sounded like fireworks at first," they later said. "But then I realized it wasn't." The neighbor ran toward the house, peering through a window to see Kayla lying on the floor, bleeding profusely. Jeremy was nowhere in sight. The neighbor immediately called 911, their voice trembling as they described the scene. "There's a woman bleeding on the floor. She's pregnant," the caller exclaimed. "Please send someone quickly." First responders arrived within minutes, but the scene that greeted them was grim. Kayla was barely conscious, her breathing shallow. The room was eerily silent, save for the muffled sounds of officers communicating over their radios. Emergency medical technicians worked frantically to stabilize Kayla, knowing that time was running out. As they loaded her into the ambulance, one paramedic remarked quietly, "We're not just fighting for one life here, we're fighting for two." Jeremy, meanwhile, had fled the scene. Police immediately began a search, issuing an alert to nearby jurisdictions and setting up roadblocks. The once quiet neighborhood was now swarming with flashing lights, sirens, and the collective shock of a community trying to process the unthinkable. Kayla was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to save her and her unborn child. Family members and friends arrived one by one, their faces etched with fear and disbelief. For hours, they waited and prayed. The night of January 19, 2025, was one that would forever leave its mark, not just on Kayla's family, but on an entire community. A peaceful Sunday evening had turned into a nightmare, leaving behind questions that would haunt everyone who knew her. But the story didn't end there. As police worked through the night to piece together what had happened, the search for Jeremy McBride intensified. Every moment that passed brought new urgency. The man responsible for this tragedy was still out there, and no one knew what he might do next. For detectives, the scene at Kayla's home was only the beginning. The blood-streaked walls, the shattered glass, and the frantic 911 call were horrifying enough, but it was what came next that revealed the full depth of the tragedy. As officers pieced together the evidence, one name kept surfacing: Jeremy McBride. Jeremy didn't run. He didn't even try to cover his tracks. When officers located him a few miles away, sitting silently in his car, the weapon used in the attack was still on the passenger's seat. His face betrayed no emotion as they approached. He stepped out without resistance, offering a single sentence: "I already know why you're here." Back at the station, the confession came quickly, and it came with chilling precision. Over hours of interrogation, Jeremy unraveled his motives, his frustrations, and the details of his plan. He didn't stammer or hesitate. It was as if he had rehearsed every word, just as he had rehearsed the act itself. "I didn't want her to have that baby," Jeremy said plainly. "It wasn't supposed to happen." His voice was cold, detached, and devoid of regret. He described how he had learned of Kayla's pregnancy through a mutual acquaintance. The news had ignited something inside him, a rage he claimed he couldn't control. Jeremy's plan wasn't impulsive. It was premeditated in every sense. He had spent weeks researching how to carry out the attack. Journal entries revealed his descent into obsession. Page after page was filled with scrawled thoughts of betrayal and revenge. "She ruined my life," one entry read. Another: "If I can't have peace, neither can she." Detectives also learned that Jeremy's purchase of the firearm had been deliberate and calculated. Receipts from a local gun shop confirmed he had bought it only days before the attack. Security footage from a nearby shooting range showed him practicing his aim, focusing intently as if preparing for the moment he would carry out his violent intentions. But what stunned detectives most was his calm recounting of the crime. "I went there knowing what I had to do," Jeremy said. "I didn't plan to walk out of that house alive." He described the scene in meticulous detail: the confrontation, Kayla's screams, the sound of the first shot. He even admitted that he had planned to turn the gun on himself once the deed was done. Prosecutors later called Jeremy's confession one of the most chilling and straightforward they had ever encountered. There were no attempts to deflect blame, no excuses. It was a full acknowledgement of what he had done and why. And yet, the confession raised as many questions as it answered. How had someone spiraled so far out of control? How had no one seen the warning signs? While Jeremy sat in a sterile interrogation room, recounting his crime, Kayla was fighting for her life. The first responders who arrived at the scene later described the gravity of her injuries. She was barely conscious, her breaths shallow and labored, as paramedics rushed her to the nearest trauma center. Every minute mattered. In the emergency room, a team of surgeons worked relentlessly to stabilize her. The damage was extensive. The bullet had torn through her abdomen, leaving her with severe internal bleeding. Her unborn child, just weeks away from viability, could not be saved. The loss was devastating, a cruel reminder of the senselessness of the attack. Doctors faced another grim decision. In order to save Kayla's life, they had to remove her left ovary and fallopian tube, both irreparably damaged. For a woman who had long dreamed of starting a family, it was a devastating blow. Yet Kayla's body fought on, defying the odds stacked against her. Family members and friends kept vigil at the hospital, their emotions a mixture of grief and hope. "She's a fighter," her sister said in a later interview. "If anyone could pull through something like this, it's Kayla." Her strength became a rallying point for those who loved her. Weeks passed, and Kayla began to heal physically, but the emotional scars were harder to mend. She later described waking up in the hospital, disoriented and in pain, only to learn that her baby was gone. The reality hit her like a tidal wave, yet even in her darkest moments, she resolved to keep going. "I wasn't going to let him take everything from me," she said. Her recovery became a symbol of resilience, a testament to the human spirit's ability to endure unimaginable pain. But as she worked to rebuild her life, Jeremy's trial loomed in the background, a constant reminder of the trauma she had survived. The courtroom was packed on the day Jeremy McBride's trial began. Journalists, legal experts, and members of the community filled every seat, all waiting to hear the outcome of a case that had gripped the nation. For Kayla, sitting in that courtroom was one of the hardest things she had ever done. But she was determined to see it through. Jeremy faced a litany of charges, including attempted murder and feticide. Prosecutors painted a damning picture of his actions, using his own confession and journal entries as evidence. They described him as a man consumed by rage and jealousy, willing to destroy not only Kayla's life, but also the life of their unborn child. Legal experts weighed in on the significance of the case. "What we're seeing here is premeditation on a level that's both shocking and rare," one said. "This wasn't a crime of passion. It was methodical, planned, and executed with precision." Domestic violence advocates also used the case to highlight the importance of recognizing warning signs in abusive relationships. "This tragedy could have been prevented," one advocate said. "We need to do more to educate people about the red flags and provide resources for those in danger." For the community, the trial was a stark reminder of how quickly life can change. Headlines and news reports detailed every twist and turn, from the harrowing testimony of first responders to the impact statements delivered by Kayla's family. As the trial concluded, the jury's decision was unanimous. Jeremy McBride was found guilty on all charges. He now faces decades behind bars, his life reduced to a series of choices that ended in violence and destruction. For Kayla, the verdict brought some measure of closure, but it could never erase what she had lost. "Justice was served," she said in a public statement, "but no amount of justice can bring my baby back." The aftermath of the case left a lasting impact on everyone involved. It was a story of pain and resilience, of tragedy and survival. And for Kayla, it was a reminder that even in the face of unimaginable loss, there is a way forward. Kayla's journey from the brink of death to standing tall today is nothing short of extraordinary. Her recovery was not just physical, it was emotional, mental, and spiritual. Through countless surgeries, months of physical therapy, and an outpouring of love from her community, she found a strength she never thought she had. Yet, her story is a stark reminder of the silent epidemic that hides in plain sight. For every survivor like Kayla, there are countless others whose stories end in tragedy. Domestic violence is not a private issue, it is a public crisis. It doesn't discriminate by race, class, or age, and it thrives on silence and stigma. In the weeks following the attack, her community rallied together. Candlelight vigils illuminated the night, not just to honor Kayla's resilience, but to remember those who didn't survive. Friends, neighbors, and strangers came together, pledging to break the cycle of abuse. The gatherings sparked important conversations. How can we protect the vulnerable? How can we intervene before it's too late? Kayla, through her courage, became a voice for others. Though the pain of her loss is a scar she will carry forever, she chose to channel her tragedy into purpose. She began speaking publicly, sharing her story in schools, shelters, and community centers, urging others to recognize the signs of abuse and act before it escalates. Her message is clear: survival is possible, and help is within reach. But Kayla's strength doesn't erase the reality of what she endured. Her story isn't just hers, It belongs to every victim who didn't get the chance to tell theirs. It's a plea for awareness, a demand for change, and a promise of hope for a future where no one has to suffer alone. If you found this story impactful, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us share stories like Kayla's, spread awareness, and inspire action. Together, we can make a difference.